I'm going to begin with a brief preamble. I am a rhetorician. What is a rhetorician, you might be asking, besides a fool? She's someone trained in making and analyzing arguments of many kinds in many modes and genres. This term rhetoric often gets used in popular culture to describe a politician's use of language, diction, or imagery to subtly entice, persuade, or anger an audience of supporters. I was trained in classical argument and rhetorical theory, to which people often respond, "Oh, you must be very good at arguing." Or if I'm dating someone at the time, they motion to that poor fellow and they say, "I bet you never win an argument, do you, buddy?" We laugh heartily. I liked this identity. I wore it around for quite a while. I would pretend I was indeed quite good at winning arguments with friends and colleagues and deans and my father over politics at Thanksgiving. And maybe I was. But here's the thing. The more I studied argument, the more fascinated I became with who and what was on the other side. Who am I trying to convince? How did they come to see the world as they did? How did I? What I learned is that we don't need more argument. That perhaps we've been misguided in our thinking that winning an argument was the desired skill set at all. Perhaps we've been misguided at our dinner tables, with our friends, with our colleagues. Perhaps we've even been misguided in our first year writing classroom, where we teach the very often assigned argument essay. Allow me to explain. As I listen around and as I look around, both online and off, I hear an abundance of argument. People are shoring up their argument in preparation for someone else's argument. And we have argument after argument. And it doesn't matter if these are good arguments or bad arguments, well-crafted or poorly crafted, because we have no listeners. No one is listening to these arguments. Listening is no longer the teachable skill. We don't have classes on listening. It's not a political tool. Nowhere are we learning how to listen to these arguments. The other day, a few weeks ago, I was teaching a rhetoric unit and my student said to me, "Dr. Campbell, if everything and everyone is an argument, why do I have to learn this?" "To wield the power of rhetoric," I retorted. And that is the right answer, I think, or that's the answer my training taught me. But it's not the answer I wish to give anymore. It's not even the question I wish to be asked. My observations here today are not altogether new. Many rhetoricians have invited us to turn away from this war-like structure of rhetoric where one argument supplants another in a pattern of colonization and turn toward a rhetoric that listens. A rhetoric that has empathy and compassion and that builds bridges across language. Kenneth Burke, a famous rhetorician, in as early as the 1960s, said that rhetoric must lead us through the scramble, the war of nerves, the war. Rhetoric has been heralded for its ability to unify, join, and create community. The flip side of that is that if there is an in-group, there is also an out-group. A separation, a dividing line. We must be careful of this as well. But to suggest, as Cynthia Haynes has, that argument has reached its breaking point, or more drastically, to break up with the lofty and lucrative industry of argumentative writing pedagogy, will meet with the most stern rebukes of further entrenchment of argument upon argument. But she says, and she's a rhetorician, so she knows what she's saying, "Let me wear the moniker of irresponsibility if it means divesting oneself of responsibility in order to probe the depths of a more responsive relation to our students, to each other, and to each other." So what I'm going to say is this. Just for today, just for this moment, maybe just for this talk, let's cease all argument. Let's relinquish the idea that the argument gets us the thing we want in the first place. Let's release having to win, persuade, convince, or offer evidence, state our claim, or change someone's mind. Release argument on all levels so we may have a more responsive relation to each other and to each other. Does that scare you? I began by saying that I was a rhetorician, but that's not the whole story. I'm a trained yogi, and I studied Buddhism for years when I left the Mormon church in search of the spiritual without the religious. And I tell you this because parts of these storied identifications will show up today in this talk, and they help shape the way I see this research and the way I give this research to you. For the rest of this talk, I want to turn toward what Buddhist nun Pema Chodron calls the places that scare us: compassion and empathy. Before we go into why these are so scary and what they are, I want to make sure we have 3 working definitions of compassion, pity, and empathy. These are interrelated terms, and they may mean different things for different people and even different scholars. But today I'm going to use the definitions in the literature as well as popular public use. And I'm going to inflect these definitions with some nuances to help you move into them in your own practices. So first, compassion. Compassion is the co-passioned orientation to the world. It is to share in passion with someone, often an overwhelming feeling or emotion. We often think of passion as related to desire and love, but it is also suffering, to share in suffering with someone. In the literature on compassion, compassion is a daily practice of recognizing and accepting our shared humanity. It's sitting with someone and sharing with someone in the darkness. This is in contradistinction to pity. Pity is what Kristin Neff calls the near enemy to compassion. It is the near enemy to compassion because it masquerades as compassion, but compassion is shared and pity is separating. Pity says, poor you. Compassion says, let me feel it with you. Pity sees the sufferer as other than herself, thus rendering the feeling unshared. This creates distance. So compassion says, let me share in this with you. Pity says, poor you as I look on from my tidy world. No one likes to feel pitied. In part, this is why. This brings us to my research, empathy. Empathy is a teachable, learnable, practicable emotion and skill tied to a compassionate orientation to the world. Empathy must be learned and taught, and even then it still may be impossible, but that doesn't mean we do away with it. Empathy becomes possible in a practice as a practice. Empathy researchers define this practice as the cognitive and emotional ability to think with and feel with someone who is wholly other than us. The cognitive part of empathy is taking an imaginative mental leap into their perspective. The emotional part of empathy is taking an affective leap into how they feel, maybe their experience, what Brené Brown calls attuning to one's experience. Now, what makes empathy so impossible is that we really struggle to feel with and think with those who are other than us, those we think are on the other side of what researchers call the empathy wall. If their experience is wholly different than ours, we struggle to think and feel with them. But that doesn't mean we do away with it. This line is a line that rhetoric knows well, us versus them. As Jodi Halpern, an empathy researcher, writes in her article, Empathy and Reconciliation, here she's talking about the aftermath of the genocide and ethnic cleansing in Rwanda. And she says, their world was in ruins, not ruined buildings, but those too, interpersonal ruins, because they saw enemies of each other and they were taught to see enemies of each other. But what she says is that these ruins can be rebuilt by reaching beyond one's own group to build interconnectedness and interdependence. But these are difficult tasks, and it took years for this to happen, and even then, there were still struggles. What she relates is that the reconciliation between former enemies is the development or the practice of empathy, which rehumanizes the other. So we know what compassion is, we know what pity is, and we know what empathy is. Now, what makes these so scary, so terrifying? Or perhaps you're already starting to see what happens when you move into these spaces. Pema Chodron says that compassion and empathy, real compassion and real empathy, are daring, in part because we can expect to feel our fear of pain, our fear that we're going to feel what they feel. But it's also because it involves learning to relax and allow ourselves to open and move into a space that could be scary to us. When we cultivate compassion, we have to cultivate a wholeness of ourselves. We have to bring our softness, our kindness, but also our cruelty and terror. It must be this way. Compassion and empathy, they are not a relationship between the healer and the wounded. They are a relationship between equals. They must sit together with each other, or there is no compassion or empathy. Let me walk you through 19th century Patrul Rinpoche's compassion practice so you can start to feel what's so scary about these. He says, imagine being in torment, an animal about to be slaughtered, a person awaiting execution. To make it more immediate, he recommended imagining ourselves in their place. He asks us to picture the image of a mother with no arms as a raging river sweeps her child away. As Pedron writes, to contact the suffering of another being fully and directly is as painful as being in that woman's shoes. For most of us, even to consider such a thing is frightening. Now let me walk you through something even scarier. A 21st century example of an empathy wall, one that you all may know well. Imagine living in the United States, a whole country of people taught to identify with and fight for their political party and beliefs. Even the sentence itself is an identity declaration. I am Republican, I am Democrat. To make it more immediate, imagine we can't talk to each other without feeling angry or our identity threatened. Imagine there are news sources that cater to and dramatize these two sides, villainizing the other. Picture anger and hate from both sides toward the other side. We argue. Imagine we no longer listen to what the other side says because we think we know their stories and beliefs at the outset. Now, what happens if instead we try an empathy practice here? Hard though it is, this kind of empathy accomplishes remarkable things. For one thing, when an enemy sees things from your point of view, she stops being your enemy. This kind of empathy can melt hearts, bring down walls, literal walls, and the walls we create, and that's what makes it dangerous. I have elsewhere discussed, not argued, that we should cultivate empathy for those we see as wholly other in our culture. That's the murderers, criminals, people we put outside of our worlds, the people we've canceled in cancel culture. And I believe this. But I want to leave you with a few empathy practices that you may take with you into your neighborhoods, your offices, and your dinner tables. First, don't argue. Relinquish the idea that the argument gets you the thing you want. We know from research that you are not likely to change someone's mind with an argument. Second, listen as openly as your own subjectivity and storied identity will allow. In this talk, I've called attention to my own subjectivity. I've told you that I left the Mormon church, that I studied yoga, I'm an academic, a rhetorician. These are my identity categories. And I've told you that so that you can see this is where I'm coming from. When we listen, we come from a place of our own subjectivity. Be aware of those, as aware as you can as you listen, so that you can listen openly. This brings us to 3, disidentify. This is a rhetorical term and a philosophical term that asks you to temporarily disidentify with that identity that's keeping you from listening. So if you're listening as a Democrat, and that's what's making it hard, so you're just shoring up your argument, can you step out of that identity category to listen as nothing or as something else, just for that moment? We know that belonging is rhetorical because there's in-groups and out-groups. And thus, at the heart of most argument is this identity category. So try not to belong, just for a few moments. 4, self-compassion. In Buddhist thinking, we struggle most with the things we have not yet accepted about ourselves. We hate most those things in ourselves we're still struggling to understand. So try to cultivate empathy for your own self, for your own darkness. See if you can feel along with yourself. And 5, others with a capital O. Now, compassion and empathy will come easily for those we perceive to be similar to us, and it will be very difficult for those we perceive to be different than us. Practice it here, especially. I've said a lot to you today. I've asked you to give up argument, just for right now. I've asked you to orient towards self-compassion, and I've asked you to practice the impossible, which is empathy. And I mean all of those things. Compassion is a co-passioned orientation to the world. It's a sharing with each of you. Once you have that orientation, you can begin to practice empathy for those around you. But just like a good yoga pose, you will never finally arrive. You will not be the most empathetic person that there ever was. You will be challenged. You will fail. You must keep practicing. Empathy is so difficult that research says we even struggle to feel empathy for our past selves. We forget her. We forget to feel for her. So try to take this with you into the world. You can try it by taking imaginative leaps into those you perceive as different than you. You can try to feel along with them, not to subsume, but to share in. Movies ask us to do this through the point of view lens, so too does literature, and so too do podcasts. Of course, none of this is helpful when you're out in the world and you've decided that the lady in the grocery store took the last broccoli, or that LA Rams fan are on the other side of the empathy wall. Empathy happens in the approximation of the practice as you're out in the world. So I hope you'll start practicing it. And finally, I'll just say that I hope that you found good in this talk, and that we may move into those places that scare us so that we can cultivate more compassion, empathy, and reduce suffering through our language and concepts. Thank you.